Let's get the book talk started. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome back to the USC EASC New Book Series for Sinophone Studies. My name is Li-Ping Chen. I'm a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow in the East Asian Studies here at the University of Southern California. I hope everyone is taking good care and staying safe during these challenging times. This new book series introduces recent publications about Sinophone studies, and our theme for spring 2022 is border crossing. In February, we discussed how contemporary China circulates in transnational discourse. In March, we talked about transnational Hong Kong style sound work and performance. And today, we will look at the defectors from the PRC to Taiwan. You can find more information on our event webpage, and I will also share the link later in the chat box. I wanted to thank Sonia and Grace for their great support for this series, and Alice and Caitlin for their help. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Society of Sinophone Studies. Today, we are very delighted to have Professor Andrew Morris here with us to talk about his new book, Defectors from the PRC to Taiwan, 1960 to 1989, The Anti-Communist Righteous Warriors. This book was published by Routledge actually just a few days ago, April 2022, fresh out of the oven. He is professor of history at California Polytechnic State University, St. Luis Obispo, and studies the modern history of Taiwan and China. He is the author of Colonial Project, National Game, A History of Baseball in Taiwan, as well as Marrow of the Nation, A History of Sports and Physical Culture in Republican China. He is also the editor of Japanese Taiwan, Colonial Rule and its Contested Legacy, also the co-editor of The Minor Arts of Daily Life, Popular Culture in Taiwan. Our discussant today is Professor Dominic Meng-Hsuan Yang. He is Associate Professor of East Asian History at the University of Missouri, Columbia. His research focuses on the massive human exodus out of China to places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and North America in mid-20th century, during and after the Chinese Communist victory. He is the author of The Great Exodus from China, Trauma, Memory, and Identity in Modern Taiwan. So now let me speak a little bit about the structure for today's event. We will begin with the author's presentation and continue with the discussing comment. And after that, we will move on to the Q&A section. For our audience, at any point during the talk, feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A box. And if possible, please include information about your affiliation. The Q&A box is located in your Zoom control panel. There, you will also find the closed caption function. Please note, the live transcript is automatically generated by Zoom. And that's all I have to say. Now, please join me to welcome Professor Morris.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I wanted to thank the USC East Asian Studies Center for sponsoring this event, and Li-Ping Chen and Grace Ryu for organizing the event, Alex and Caitlin for also helping to set things up, and of course, everyone who's out there attending this. And then I'm really looking forward to Professor Yang's comments later. His work has been really informative and I think really definitive on this larger topic as well. So I'd like to get the presentation going and show you a lot of these images and help explain some of the stories that I'm talking about in this work. And so again, this is the title of my book, Defectors from the PRC to Taiwan, 1960 to 1989, The Anti-Communist Righteous Warriors. And this is the image that I wanted on the book cover. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it. But we'll come back to this image and we'll say some more about how this situation came to be later on. This is the actual book cover. And so I just wanted to mention that as it notes here, that this work is part of the Routledge series on the Cold War in Asia. They put out a call in 2018, and so I was really excited to get this work accepted in that series, and I'm very grateful to the people there for their support and their rigor, and I hope that all shows through in this work. So I wanted to start the narrative actually kind of the other way around, and start with an event in 2001 that takes place long after the history that I'm actually talking about. And I'll apologize if it's kind of a spoiler, and it's not perhaps properly historical to start things this way, but it does actually represent the event that got me interested in this larger topic and maybe even looking into it. On YouTube, one can find video of this man, Zhuo Changren, age 53, being escorted out of the Taipei Detention Center in August 2001 to a waiting van. He was walking very slowly and dramatically on these crutches you see here. And this was a very shocking sight in 2001, because Zhuo had become a very well-known and heroic figure in Taiwan 18 years previously, when he and 5 friends from Shenyang had hijacked a passenger jet to South Korea and then asked for asylum in Taiwan. After serving 15 months prison time in South Korea, the Zhuo Changren 6, as they'd come to be called, were freed and allowed to transit to Taiwan. There they became anti-communist stars, as you see here meeting with President Jiang Jingguo, and symbolizing, for a time at least, a hot-blooded righteous opposition to communist rule in the PRC. And so in the bottom right image, you see Zhuo there in the center, and he was the central figure in this event. But 18 years later, after the hijacking, here he was being escorted to this van that would take him and one of those people we just saw in that picture, Jiang Hongjun, who was a fellow murderer. They not only had hijacked a plane together in 1983, but they had murdered someone together in 1991. And this van was taking them to the firing squad. And so in this video, when I decided not to show it because it's upsetting if you know what it's about, but Zhuo pauses when he reaches the van and he throws his head back and he yells, "Long live the Republic of China. Long live the reunification of China. Long live the Chinese people. I'm being wronged. I'm clean. I'm innocent." And minutes later, these 2 former heroes were dead. So in 2001, I was riveted to hear about this news. And I think it was probably easy at that point for someone like me to see this Fangong Yishi, this institution of the anti-communist righteous warriors, cynically. If this is what had become of them, some of the most famous ones, I think it would have been easy for many to see this as kind of an absurd history. But I decided to try a little bit harder to understand what this institution meant in the for almost exactly 30 years, the entire 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and how the meanings of these individuals and their defections to Taiwan changed over those 30 years. So in this work, I chose to focus on the defectors who came most dramatically by air and by sea. There were many other kinds of defectors. Some of them were separated out in the official kind of language. Some of them were called Fangong Yi Bao, which meant something like the anti-communist righteous compatriots. But I wanted to look at the ones who really captivated people's attention in Taiwan, much more than the other kinds of defectors. And there were many, many more of the kind who were perhaps refugees who came to Hong Kong first and then to Taiwan. Occasional low-level diplomats or musicians or writers who would be living abroad from the PRC, who were living abroad and decided to defect. Essentially, indirectly and much less dramatically. And so when these more dramatic figures would make their defections, mainlanders in Taiwan, many of whom felt so humiliated and unappreciated, exiled among what many of them saw as the uncultured and slow-moving Taiwanese, joyfully celebrated these defections, hoping that each of these events would bring them closer to a nationalist reconquest of the mainland and their own returns home. But then in studying this history, of course, we have to face the fact that none of this happened. None of the predictions came true. None of the optimism that these defections engendered for 30 years paid off in any way. And so to me, I think it's an interesting topic for all these reasons. So I think most people are familiar with the original group of Fangong Yishi, who were the 14,000 plus Chinese POWs who chose to be repatriated to the ROC on Taiwan in 1954 after the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. So there's much more work on that group of these original anti-communist righteous warriors. But the group that I'm studying, I was just very surprised to see how very, very little there was about them, and even in Taiwan, very little work on this group. And so the history of this group of Fangong Yishi that I'm studying began in January 1960. There's a PLA Naval Air Force squadron of MiG-15s took off from Luqiao Airfield in Taizhou in Zhejiang province. And the pilot of this MiG here left his squadron and began flying almost directly south. He was pursued by 9 PLA Naval Air Force jets. But then pretty soon the ROC Air Force discovered this MiG headed directly for Taiwan. They immediately scrambled their own jets, notified the American authorities of the Naval 7th Fleet and in Okinawa. Fortunately, this pilot had the presence of mind to signal his intentions to the ROC planes. He dropped to an altitude of several hundred feet and put down his landing gear. These were gestures that followed instructions that had been sent out on broadcasts from stations like Voice of Free China and on leaflets dropped by airplane or carried by balloons to the mainland for many years. Unfortunately, the pilot was killed though when the MiG crashed into a rocky area, skidded for hundreds of meters, and then caught fire in northeast Taiwan in Ilan County, just right on the beach. Chiang Kaishek recorded that event soberly in his diary that very night, and he wrote that a commie bandit MiG crashed on the beach in Ilan. The pilot died and only his skull remained. He wrote that this significant incident occurred because the bandit army's psychology has been beaten down. It proves that when we begin the counterattack, the bandit army will weaken, which will greatly increase the faith and confidence of our own army. We see here the plane being taken to a warehouse, inspected by military leaders, and then put on display for January 23rd Freedom Day, which is the day commemorating when those earlier the POWs had arrived in Taiwan in 1954. One of the first points that the ROC media made about this defection attempt was that the pilot had been attracted to fly to free China because of President Chang's 6 great freedoms and 3 great promises. These came in a speech of October 1957, when for the first time Chang set out an official guarantee of rewards and political rights for all mainland compatriots who defected to free China. It's also interesting, it's also interesting that this offer by Chang plagiarized essentially an earlier offer from Peng Dehuai coming in the other direction in January 1955, when Peng had promised financial rewards and medical care, equal and humane treatment, and respect for personal property for the patriotic soldiers who left the ROC units and returned to the new socialist motherland. And I see these competing promises as a great example of the process of mirror imaging that Michael Soni has described, the mutual borrowing of ideologies and techniques by these mortal enemy regimes that also remind us of their shared origins just decades earlier. So this is one example of the kinds of leaflets that were dropped all over the PRC, as illustrated, kind of dramatically in this picture here. But this went on for decades, and so the military and the government put a lot of effort and a lot of resources into these either balloon shipments of goods or airdrops. So for example, between May and September of 1960, ROC and CIA planes made 123 airdrops over 28 Chinese provinces, including 721 districts and cities. They dropped 3,500 metric tons of rice, 1,200 metric tons of consumer goods like wool and cotton goods, toothpaste, soap, cigarettes, candy, canned meat, toys, and first aid kits, and over 100 million letters, leaflets, and informative brochures. One wonders if this kind of brochure may have been even more influential than President Chang's promises. This followed the 1958 policy for awards to communist bandit, Army, Navy, and Air Force officers and personnel who rise in insurrection and return home. And you see here that it showed the distances from different airports in the mainland to Taiwan, to different airports in Taiwan, and then also the amounts of gold that you would receive for bringing different kinds of planes. So for example, the MiG-15 that late pilot had tried to fly to Taiwan would have earned 1,000 taels of gold. At that time, that was worth about 43,000 US. So instead, the ROC pledged that this fortune would be given to his family at the time that they retook the mainland. And so this is the text of this leaflet. These were the next pilot defectors to make news in Taiwan the next year. And so part of what I'm trying to do here is explain some of the stories, because this history is based actually pretty closely on these stories of this fairly small numbers of individuals. So it's this interesting case where you had just a few of these kinds of defections over a 30-year period, but every time it happened, they were invested with this great import for the fate of the mainland and the ROC's ability to retake it someday. And so this is another one of these interesting stories where Xiao Xien, who's on our left in this picture, was the pilot. This was a plane that was assigned for crop dusting work in Shandong, and he flew it all the way to Kao Island in South Korea. Gao Yozong on our right was not informed of this and was not happy about this defection taking place. He was an unwilling participant in this defection that Xiao, on his part, had been planning for months. And he had a much harder time with this decision. The two were in Korean custody after they landed in Korea for several weeks. The KCIA reported to the ROC Foreign Ministry and also to the American CIA that Gao, again on our right, had tried to kill himself several times while in custody. We can imagine the kinds of thinking that you would go through at this time if you were an unwilling defector. He told the Koreans that he was unwilling to go to Taiwan. He insisted on being turned over to UN forces and then being allowed to cross into North Korea and then back to the PRC. But then he said, even if you don't let me, it doesn't matter, because the CCP will occupy Taiwan within 5 or 10 years anyway. We can see in the Foreign Ministry archives that in Taiwan, they worried about what was going to happen when he was brought to Taiwan. They were planning a big welcome, and they're worried if Gao might do something to quote unquote act up and make things unpleasant. The two of these heroes met with President Chang. Gao was thoroughly searched, even though Xiao, the pilot, was not. Gao was told not to speak, lest he say something impolite. He still did speak, and he told Chang he did not want to be part of the ROC Air Force. Instead, he was assigned to the field of psychological warfare. And then the bigger picture here is their plane also on public display. The next defector in 1962, Liu Cheng, had a more kind of standard, straightforward story. And there's a very real range of stories among these different defectors. He had been obsessed with the idea of defecting ever since he had heard about the original attempt in 1960, where the pilot had crashed. He was more motivated by listening to Taiwan broadcasts on a transistor radio that he'd purchased. He thought that Shanghai was deserted and grim. He said it's quiet and drab with no chic women anymore. So he had other kinds of ideas reasons to try to get to Taiwan. When he had a chance to fly his MiG-15 solo, he flew due south to Mazu and then straight east to Taiwan. An editorial in the United Daily News declared that Liu's defection had invigorated the hearts of free Chinese while shocking the nerves of the communist bandits. The bandit puppet's government has today become fragmented and shattered, a complexion of 1,000 sores and 100 holes, with constant natural disasters, a collapsed economy, and the main reason is their cruel and violent rule. We see him, of course, here with Chiang Kaishek, and then also the ROC Air Force Commander-in-Chief, Chen Jiasong. And then we also see him in the story on the newest of these leaflets that would then be dropped over the mainland. And so every time there's one of these defections, it would almost immediately become the subject of more leaflets. And we see the rare case of ROC publications in simplified characters here. An even more meaningful image was this one of the 3 successful defectors here, so far, paying their respects at the grave of the late 1960 Mig Pilot, which is simply marked the anti-communist insurrectionist Air Force martyr. It's never been totally exactly determined what that pilot's name was, although there are theories, and you can find those online. But this recursive self-referential image of the defectors made for a powerful representation of this trend. These were only 4 men, but their anti-communist insurrectionist actions over just 26 months seemed to bode well for an ROC reconquest of the mainland. And so these righteous warriors who defected in the 1960s, willingly or not, served an important purpose vis-a-vis ROC nationalism and official discourse. After 15 or 20 years in Taiwan, many mainlander emigres, as Dr. Yang has written about, were seriously wondering if they would ever make it home. The KMT's promises of democracy and material abundance were little compensation for the slack, longing for home and dependence that characterized the lives of so many of the former soldiers who were not educated or connected enough to advance in this modern society. And so on the eve of the first MiG defection attempt in 1960, a writer in the magazine Free China had submitted a piece on how emptiness in the present and shattered hope for the future was the main theme of Taipei's society from top to bottom. Beginning in 1960, though, these defector events, by definition evocative of action and will, helped quiet their doubts and sustain the regime's legitimacy. There were a couple more important defections in the 60s that I'm going to skip over here in the interest of time. But again, the main point I wanted to make about them is, maybe just go back to this slide one more time, is the power of these pilots who came from the PRC, who could speak very, very closely and expertly on the famine, the violence, and the corruption of the Maoist PRC. And then they could also explain their gratitude towards Chang's KMT and their awe of the rich society that was developing in Taiwan. They didn't complicate things as some daring Taiwanese citizens did by bringing in annoying comparisons to the former Japanese colonial regime. And they were perfectly used to one-party authoritarian rule. So they did not engage in critiques of the government or ask for more political rights. I'm going to jump here to 1977, when this is maybe the most timely and most significant one of any of these defections. It happened to be on the 40th anniversary of the Marco Polo Bridge incident. So this was on July 7th of 1977. And this is Squadron Commander Yuan Yen of the 1st Reconnaissance Wing of the PLA Air Force. And he flew to the Tainan airport. His defection is probably best remembered for the inspiring press conference that he gave later that day in Taipei. And now these were all televised. So this press conference was part of 40 straight hours on the network CTS, or Hua Shi, and they called it Flight to Freedom coverage. He was uneasy at first in front of this audience. He's still in his uniform here when he gave the press conference, and you can find this on YouTube as well. But soon we get a sense of the very plain eloquence and authentic bitterness and rage that he had towards the brutality of Maoism. He became very emotional, giving testimony to the miserable lives of the 800 million people of the mainland, especially the farmers who had nothing to eat or wear, the constant trickery and lies practiced by the CCP, the repeated attempts at popular uprisings against the regime, and the lack of any real political or social freedoms, even the ones that were guaranteed in the PRC Constitution. He had listened to ROC broadcasts for years, and so he knew the language, and he knew the currency of how to talk to people in Taiwan, even though he literally just showed up that day. His answer to the 4th question of the press conference, when he pledged to fight on the front line to take back the mainland, won him a standing ovation. And pretty soon he got the crowd even more excited when he picked up his service pistol here and held it over his head. And then he started reflecting very emotionally about the fact that the communist government might very well retaliate against his family. And he hoped that the US President Jimmy Carter would apply his human rights diplomacy to this case and try to protect his family. This was an event that was experienced almost instantaneously by the great majority of Taiwan's population. And so indeed, the coverage of Fan's defection, I mentioned 40 straight hours of television coverage, much of the coverage actually was about coverage. And so if you look at the official ROC newsreel on the event of Fan Yuanyan's defection in 1977, fully a fifth of it is images of people in Taiwan learning about his defection, mainly on TV. We see them watching television sets in public areas or city streets, next to vendors in small alleys and in their homes. So not only was Taiwan a technologically advanced society, but also one joined by bonds of nationalism and anti-communism. Images like this very quickly also became part of the kind of incessant body of leaflets and propaganda that was sent back to the mainland. And you can get a sense of this domestic ideal, this prosperous ideal. The four men at the top are all previous defectors that we've been talking about. Fan is in the middle here in the bottom, and then their wives that they'd married in Taiwan are here in the bottom row. I've chosen not to give their names, and in my book I do the same thing. And I can talk more about this, but there's this whole body of a discussion of these women's lives and who they were and the reason why they married these defectors. I'd rather leave them out of it and just focus more on the defectors. But the government also worked to take advantage of this defection and push this language of human rights that Jimmy Carter had made a main part of his campaign platform just the year before. And essentially they were doubling down on this, hoping that if they could show that this was a sign that Taiwan had an actual kind of recognition of human rights, that as you see here, the Chinese communists did not, they hoped that this might convince Carter to change his plans to normalize relations with the PRC. As we know, it didn't work at all. But this was part of the plan for months in Taiwan. In the end, Fan's lasting impact was that he took a very conservative position. At some point after he arrived in Taiwan, he started complaining about the decadent TV programs, shows where the women singers wriggle so much, the women that wrote letters to him saying they wanted to be friends with him, the men who wore tight pants in Taipei, the drug use, pornography, gender-bending clothing he saw in Taipei that he thought were emblems of a sick society. He reflected on the weaknesses of the free world and said that America and Japan were places where people had a harder and harder time controlling their desires. He told America's Newsweek magazine, "Sometimes I wonder if Taiwan hasn't adopted too many things from the West." So ultimately, his lasting impact in Taiwan was to strengthen the conservative wing of the KMT. I see that I'm almost getting to the point where Dr. Yang's going to come in. So I'm going to maybe finish things up with this image here that I started with. And Wurong Gun, this defector who came in 1982. There were several years between Fan's defection and then Wu's defection. He was another one of the ones who flew to South Korea, and we can talk some more about this. Mainly the reason is this is pilots in North Korea the pilots in North China simply did not have enough fuel to fly all the way to Taiwan. So flying to South Korea was the easiest way for them to then indirectly get to Taiwan. So he landed in South Korea. He had a pre-written statement that he had prepared, renouncing his CCP membership, rejecting communism, asking to see the ROC ambassador, and stating that he hoped to proceed to Taiwan. When he did get to Taiwan a few weeks later, on Chiang Kai-shek's birthday, He gave another very dramatic press conference and then asked if he could meet Deng Lijun and Teresa Teng. He listened to her music broadcasted on the Ministry of National Defense broadcasts. The military also had started sending Teresa Teng cassettes over with these baskets of goodies that were sent over by a balloon. And so this is actually a press conference before a formal concert at the Air Force Base near Taichung. And he spoke very movingly about what her voice meant. And so he said, Deng Lijun was sitting at this, you see this table in the background, and she was sitting there looking up at him as he spoke. And he said, Miss Teng looks exactly as I had imagined, sweet and gentle. And we see her actually starting to cry. And he says, the communist bandits truly fear Miss Teng's voice. I believe after we unify China, the youth of the mainland, the people of the mainland will definitely see Miss Teng. And the sound of her songs will definitely flutter over the mainland. I think those days are almost here. And so again, as we know, those days never came at all. But for this period during the 60s and 70s and 80s, these were some of the very biggest stars in Taiwan. So I think there's different elements of the history that I hope we can get into more, both the history itself, these stories, and then actually how quickly after 1991, when this system was ended by the new president Lee Teng-hui, how this very, very quickly became almost obsolete, almost a forgotten history. So I'm going to stop sharing here and really look forward to Professor Yang's comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Morris. That's a very, very nice presentation. And I will also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone here, especially Li-Ping, Grace, Caitlin, Alexandra, for helping to organize this workshop and for inviting me to be a part of it. Now, we are a little bit over time, so I'm gonna sort of write down the time right now so I don't take time away from our Q&A, because this is an extremely interesting book. I first learned about this research from, and by the way, congratulations, really, congratulations, Andrew, for producing it. Because it is a rarity that people do research on, this kind of topic in this stretch of history in post-war Taiwan. We're talking about Cold War history. We're talking about cross-strait relations, but cross-strait relation in a sense that it's not the international politics, right? It's not the US, China, the new Soviet Union, nuclear war. It's not that, but it's actual people, crossing, that dividing line. And then, and have different imaginations of one another. Like, of course, we're in Andrew's book, we're seeing, the mainland Chinese people in the PRC Air Force sort of imagining what Taiwan is like and really want to basically get to Taiwan because they're not happy with their own reality, right? And as I will also talk about at the end of my comments, there were a lot more on the Taiwanese side, especially these mainlanders that we talked about, that the people that are in the National Army, who were also extremely unhappy with their situation in Taiwan, and there were traffic in this other direction, and which almost no one do any research on, and I think at least I want to sort of structure my my sort of comment a little bit, but there's just so much in this book and that I find extremely inspiring. For me, as a historian of post-war Taiwan, as a historian of migration between China and Taiwan, and also and just basically a social historian, that there's really so much. Like I said, after I read this book, right, it really inspired me to go back into the archives and look at this traffic in the other direction, in which I found a lot, especially in the 1950s. And these were not reported in the Taiwanese newspaper. Why would they report it, right? Because as Andrew talks about, the whole point, the reason why, these communists, PLA pilot was such huge celebrity, and they were like, we're here now in a different time. Taiwan today is very different from Taiwan in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? So you got to be a historian to be understand this. But if you go back in that time, they're really the rock stars of their time, right? And so, but then if you have people here from Taiwan going, that means, they want that other China, right? And that means they're, it's sort of propaganda in the opposite direction. And this is why, the nationalists will sort of play up on people coming in, and they will really play down on like, oh, this never happened. Like it's all classified, all of this stuff. And so I sort of wanted to make that the last point, but they just came out earlier. So, but again, so my first point is really historiography, the kind of possibility that this works open up. I first learned about this in 2017, because I was put in a panel in the Taiwan Studies Conference, the NASA conference with Andrew, and this is the first time I learned about it. And now, of course, I read the entire book, and back then I was already pretty impressed, by the research and by all these amazing stories. I mean, these are, of course, human beings that we're talking about. Very small number of people, but they're extremely important in showing us that, that period of history that a lot of contemporary historians, whether they work in, like even the ones who work in Taiwan, like Taiwanese historians, people that are in academia, Sinica, Institute of Taiwan History, they're not really looking into this, right? It's an area and a period where, almost no one. Like I've, before Andrew published this book, right, I read only one MA thesis about on this subject, right? And Andrew is very kind enough to acknowledge, that thesis, done by Taiwanese graduate student. It's fabulous, also. So yeah, it's a very interesting and important topic, and the other aspect, other than the historiography of the Cold War, and this is another aspect, which is also related to historiography, is this kind of research get us to think about the periodization of the Chinese Civil War. Now, we all know the Chinese Civil War ends, like officially ends in 1949, right? And then after that, it was like China and Taiwan, they're divided. But, even in my own work, I started to question that, right? Because you have, you do have these two Chinas. Of course, not a lot of people can, go in between these two Chinas, but in the back of the people's mind, how they imagine one another, right? I'm here in Taiwan, I'm imagining, whether this imagination is sort of sponsored or forced upon by the state, or in a sense that if you're talking about populations like the mainlanders on Taiwan, as Andrew mentioned, right? In the 50s and 60s and 70s, they wanted really to return to China. and the idea that they're going to be stuck in Taiwan forever just pains them, right? So it's extremely important for, these people to come and for the state to make them celebrities. And then psychologically, it makes at least the mainlander population feels better, and they continue to support the state, and that really feeds into their sort of imagination of the other side, right? I mean, that's that regime's going to fail, because here's the evidence, here's the proof, like people voting with their feet, right? And there is an understanding that most people could not come because they can't go across this strait of water. That's a physical barrier. And the British colonial government, as all these other governments, are not really letting the Chinese people out. The communists are not letting the Chinese people out. They don't let the Chinese people cross their border, and the Chinese government is not letting them out. But these pilots, right, they took risk to come out and to spread the news, and so it is, yeah. So what I'm trying to say is Cold War culture. Like, how do you understand Cold War societies, especially societies that are divided during the Cold War? And it is through these individuals, and also story is about them. And of course you can say, well, it's basically state narratives, right? But if you look at the photos, not only is propaganda, or the story is not only is propaganda, but about the reflection in which these societies sort of imagine the other side. And I think that will be an area that you can do sort of not only social history, but cultural history. So yeah, so I think, this is one of the contributions that I found in the book. Now, let me sort of see if there are other things I want to sort of talk about. Yeah, the last point, which I think I already sort of mentioned, yes, it's actually the point I'd start my comment with is, looking at this history, which nobody ever writes about, not even Taiwan specialists. And you really get to, sort of wonder, right, how much, that of the stuff about post-war Taiwan or Taiwan's relation with China that we do not know. We thought we know everything, right? And no. So the idea. So I read this book, in September 2021. Because that was the time when Andrew wrote to me that, Dominic, could you write a blurb for this book? And I said, fine, I'll sit down and read it. I was going to just read the introduction, but because the narratives are so interesting, the book is so fascinating, I sat down and finished the entire thing, like, in 2 days. Of course, back then I was in a quarantine hotel in Taiwan. Sitting around with nothing to do for 2 weeks, because last year when you return to Taiwan, you still need to do the 2 weeks, right? But that, after reading the book, right, like when I was actually out of the quarantine, I went into the archives to look for historical sources. I started looking different directions. And like I said, lo and behold, I find something really, really interesting, because if you look at Andrew's book, all of the the defection really started, the direction coming from the PRC really started in late 50s and 60s. The first successful case that Andrew mentioned is 1960, right? And it seems that in the 50s, there's no one coming from the mainland side. And that in itself is quite an interesting phenomenon, right? I don't know why, I don't know how to explain that. Like, if you ask me right off the top about that, I would say that it is still, this is before I guess all the crazy experiments, Mao socialist experiments started, and then in the late 1950s, that's the time when a lot of people would think this is crazy. And that's the time when the regime really went wrong. That could be an explanation. But if you look at things from the Taiwanese side, right, the nationalist pilots, and an overwhelming majority of them in the 1950s were mainlanders. And a lot of them were not happy with the nationalists, right? And they will, and there were people who successfully, went over, and on their, like, when the moment that they realize they're out of the range of missiles or whatever control of Taipei, they'll just say on radio, "Fuck you, Chiang Kaishek, I'm going back to China." What right do you have to keep me here, right? and so, but there were more people, more pilots in Taiwan who were discovered before they ever get onto the plane. So that's part of the white terror regime, in which a lot of mainlanders also suffer, right? And then if you take a look at that, it'll be like, oh, then there's another issue. How many of the pilots from the PRC side wanted to make it over to Taiwan and didn't make it? I think someone in China should do that research, although maybe given the political circumstances in China, that cannot be done. And I'm sure that's in the archives, right? And then all the prevention, how much oil we put in each plane when they're on mission, right? And then when they're in certain radar range, how we should, the preventive measures to get them now. So that is all very interesting history. I think I should stop, because if you guys let me go, and I'll just go on. But anyway, that will be my comment. Fascinating research, job well done. It's a wonderful book that I will recommend everyone who are interested in history of Cold War in Asia, history of Taiwan, and for China specialists to also read this, or PRC specialists to read this as well. So again, once again, congratulations, well done, and that will be all for me.
Right. So I just want to thank you both again, Professor Morris, for this great overview about this kind of dramatic defection and how they are being represented as a spectacle and then being used as a propaganda for the nationalist regime. And also thank you, Dominic, for this amazing comment in terms of, historiography, but also how to think about the periodization. And I was also thinking about, when we talk about post-war Taiwan specifically, which war are we talking about, right? Post-war Pacific War, Chinese Civil War, or a Cold War, or maybe all of them. And especially this question about, we all know when war ended. There's a specific day, document were signed, so on and so forth. But how about post-war? How is this period being understood or being framed or being periodized? And when was or could post-war period ended, or how was that look like? And I think this is a question for me with the cases of Fangong Yishu to continue to think about. We have been in the so-called post-war period for decades, but more and more issues are actually just coming up and services. So I could keep talking too, but I guess now I'll see Professor Morris, if you'd like to respond to Dominic's comment. And then for our audience, just feel free to submit your comments or questions to the Q&A box, and then we will get to the Q&A time very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yang, for your really generous comments. And you mentioned many of the points that are, I think, really close to my heart. I'm actually going to answer something that Li-Ping mentioned, just so I don't forget. I really like this, what you just brought up of when does the post-war begin? And I'm realizing that in each of these defections was made into a way to stave off the post-war, to keep the idea going that we're still at war. And so I'm pretty sure, if I don't have this wrong in my head, that it's over these 30 years, between 1960 and 1989, that there were 13 of these military pilots, and there were 18 individuals, which a pretty small number over a 30-year period. And as Dr. Yang is saying, far fewer than went from Taiwan to the PRC. But somehow there was this great investment then, that every time one of them came, it might be years in between, but that it really authenticated one person's actions could be taken to represent the will and the dreams of 800 million, 900 million, by the end. One of the points that Dr. Yang mentioned also that I think is really important, excuse me, is actually the question of why so little is done on this topic. And I tried to think that through a little bit in the book, and maybe you can tell me what you think of this, but I think that because it was such a spectacle, to use Li-Ping's term, and so easily seen as just propaganda, state narrative, I think there's almost like a distaste to go back and open that up, that it's just so clearly, you know, from a certain way, not authentic, that it could be seen that way, that it was such a packaged experience. And of course, the media coverage was you know, closely controlled. Although that does start to come apart by the mid 80s, and we start to learn much more about these individuals. So we learn which of these people actually didn't want to defect and who just happened to be in the plane when the pilot decided to go. The fights that are going on in the airplanes, actually, as one of the guys is trying to land in Taiwan and he's got two people hitting him, trying to prevent him from doing that, and so on. But I think I was really struck by how few scholars saw this as worth opening up. I would love to have to learn from other people and kind of taking different perspectives, and as Dr. Yang is saying, to look at the ones going the other way. And so in my very last chapter in the book, I looked very briefly at 5 cases of these mainlander pilots who do, you know, go back. And they seem to be kind of maybe the 5 most maybe known cases or kind of interesting cases. One I like in particular because the pilot flew Jiang Weiguo's own plane from Taiwan to China. I had to include that one. But then some of the other ones are more known events that, you know, made the New York Times and things like that. And I think that there's a fascinating history in there. And I was hoping to do more with those stories. I think that would be just as interesting a set of stories. But I think that will just fall to someone else to do. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. And I'll just say people, maybe just go back to the first thing that I wrote down that Dr. Yang said about people crossing. And that is actually the first way that I imagined studying this. I thought that looking at these Fangong Yishu was going to be one chapter in a book about different moments in the 20th century of people crossing between Taiwan and China. It's just that when I started looking at it more and more, it just became more interesting than, you know, simply one chapter's worth. But again, thanks to both of you for your thoughts and your readings, and love to take other questions.
All right, so now we will be moving on to the Q&A session, and then we already have some questions coming in. And the first question is from Eden Bobenek, and especially about what happened after they defected to Taiwan. What's their life look like, and whether they are treated as quote unquote spy by the nationalist regime. So let me read the question. Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I found it really interesting. I was curious if you came across anything that discussed the post-arrival debrief. Were the KMT worried that these defectors may be spies from the PRC? The 50s and 60s were a time of great paranoia about the so-called leftists in Taiwan. Were they worried about the potential risks to national security?
Great, this is a really good question. The debrief is something that I've been really, really fascinated about. For some of them, they got it both in South Korea and in Taiwan, for the people that flew to Korea. The people that flew that way landed in South Korea and then made their way to Taiwan. They had to stay there a very long time, as I was suggesting. And I haven't found any evidence about what those we can only call them interrogations. I assume they have to be called interrogations. I've never seen any details of what went on other than that they lasted for so long. And I think the only traces I saw were in the one story about Gao Youzong in 1961, who's furious and just saying, I don't want to be here, let me go home. But what you start to figure out though is that what's really interesting when they do make it to Taiwan, the ones who fly directly to Taiwan, they have their press conferences that day. So when I showed Fan Yuan Yen, he gets there at noon or so, and by 6 o'clock he's in Taipei at the Officers Club doing this press conference. But there's a lot that happens in between. And so another clue that we have is that you can see that the photographers and the media are kept very, very, very far away from the planes when they land. There's images that are recreated later of ROC pilots who are hugging Fan and other pilots too. They throw them into the air and they carry them on their shoulders, and they're slapping their backs and things like that. And there's remarks that are always reported about what Fan's first words were when he jumped out of the plane. I think we can only imagine his first words have to do like, please don't shoot me, I'm trying to defect. Because the record of their first words are always different depending on where you look. But we can, I think, I've always just imagined that these are very, very close questioning, even if in some of the cases they're pretty quick. I think we have to be pretty clear that they're being very careful for the reasons that the questioner just mentioned. And then some people have wondered if maybe they're taking that time to also pump kind of talking points into them, KMT language, but it happens so fast that I think that it really is that they've learned how to talk about this from these broadcasts. Some of them have seen the flyers for sure, but then we know that almost all these pilots were listening to the broadcast in their dorms. And so they're familiar with the kind of language, and they know immediately, most of them know immediately how to talk when they get to Taiwan. But then also, there was part of the question about were they trusted, and another part of the answer is that none of these people ever flew again once they made it to Taiwan. They were all given other kinds of positions in the Air Force, mainly just kind of for the prestige. They were famous people. They were famous members of the Air Force. Some of them might teach later on or something, but they were absolutely not trusted to get back into an airplane because they might just go back. Part of the effect of this is that even though it's the PRC that's calling them traitors, no one in Taiwan would call them traitors, but they all kind of know that they are in a certain way. And they know that many of them left their families in China. So I think that part is also really interesting. And sometimes you'll see the defectors who are in certain ways justifying why they left their families behind, and that the revolution sometimes means sacrificing yourself and sacrificing your family. But it's, and it's, far be it for me to judge someone like that who's lived through the things that these people live through and the choices that they face and things like that. But I think that it definitely, the fact that none of them ever flew again absolutely tells us that they were not trusted in that way. And even though they were heroes, there was still this other thing about them that everyone always was remembering. Just put it that way.
Thank you. And we have another question, and this is about actually South Korea. Earlier, you mentioned that some of them actually first go to South Korea because maybe they don't have, enough fuels and gas to go to Taiwan. But this question is about the kind of like the people, and also maybe the South Korea relation with Taiwan and also East Asia in general. So let me read the question. This is from Jin Hei Kim. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, and congratulations on the book again. It is quite fascinating to learn that pilots from North China choose South Korea as their first stop. I'm aware that some of the Chinese POWs who refused to go back to the PRC after the Korean War also remained in South Korea as Taiwanese diaspora. I'd like to hear more about the relationship between South Korea, Taiwan, and diasporic communities in Korea, especially after Taiwan was expelled from the UN in 1971.
That is a group that I really know nothing about. So I assume what we're talking about is an ROC diaspora there. I really have no way of answering that. I can say that, especially by the 80s, again, I mentioned one defection in 1961 that went through Korea, but there were several in the 80s. And I think those all had to do with, just the fact that the pilots' fuel was limited when they would go up for these missions. And there were so many of them in the 80s. And I think what's important about that moment is how touchy this was for the Republic of Korea, for South Korea, when they had this alliance with Taiwan, this anti-communist alliance with the ROC on Taiwan, but were also definitely trying to open ties with the PRC. So these were always very delicate moments when they seemed to be going back and forth between two different, a certain kind of loyalty and then a certain kind of ambition, for the economy. It's easy to understand. And so they would pretty much try to play it both ways. They would say, like in the case of Wu, I showed at the very end, they said on humanitarian grounds, we're going to let him go to Taiwan. And at some point they stopped saying go to Taiwan, but they would say on humanitarian grounds, we'll let the pilot go to a third country. Okay. They're going to Taiwan, but they wouldn't say Taiwan. But then the plane would always go back to China. And so what's also interesting is that someone like Wu, who came in 1982, he got more than $2 million for defecting, but they never even got the plane. And in that earlier flyer that I showed you, that leaflet, the value was supposed to be for the certain kind of airplane that you flew to ROC territory. But for all those people who flew, and sometimes they would land at airports in South Korea, sometimes they crashed in South Korea, those planes never were sent to Taiwan. They were always sent back to the PRC. And so South Korea had to always be negotiating that. There was one case where naval defectors had made it to South Korea. They were sent back. And I think it's something about that. It's that their arrivals were not as dramatic as the pilots. And so sometimes these pilots would fly to South Korea and there would be incredible panic, air raid alarms. One of the flights, I want to say in 1983, I think that was Sun Tianqin's defection. It was the first time that the certain level air raid alert had been sounded since the Korean War. And all they knew was a Chinese MiG was headed towards Seoul. And it was the same model of MiG, maybe a 17, that was used by North Korea. So there's incredible panic. Everyone knows in South Korea when this happens. So they have to at least kind of observe their relationship with Taiwan. But for these naval defectors, the point I was trying to make is that I think there was something about that where they didn't have to observe that. They were sent back. And there were violent demonstrations outside the South Korean embassy in Taipei. One person even immolated himself and died as a protest against the ROK. And so I think that's a really interesting part. And I think I was only really able to investigate kind of the government's position in having to, and I think what I would say is they really played it by the book. They tried to go by the Hague Convention. They tried to observe the wishes of people who were fighting against authoritarianism, but they also wanted to punish the hijackers. And so I think that they seem to probably succeed in handling it in a fairly neutral manner, with a lot riding on it, I think, in these two different alliances that they have. But I'm not able to kind of go further into Korean society and talk about that.
All right, thank you. And Dominic, just feel free if you have anything to add or to think about any things that you would like to share with us. And then moving on, we have another question from Brian Bernard. Hi, Brian. This question is for Professor Morris about the transition from your last book to this book. So both is about Taiwan, but the subject matter is very different. So let me read the question. Thank you, Professor Morris and Professor Yang, for this enriching discussion. I'm very much looking forward to reading this book, as I learned so much from your previous book on the history of Taiwanese baseball, which was incredibly fascinating. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the transition process from the subject of your previous book on baseball to this one about anti-communist defectors. And perhaps you could address the Cold War discursive intersections between the two research areas in terms of how the KMT government and state media created meanings for the major handling events around both baseball and military defections.
Wow, that's a really good question. So I have to, so I think what I was just saying about my first kind of thoughts about writing on this actually had to do with this, like I said, this idea of crossing. And I had written one book about Republican China, the second book about Taiwan, and essentially the Japanese legacy in Taiwan. And I really was thinking, I was just kind of oriented towards thinking about something that was about both, and something that was about, like I said, the people that were crossing back and forth. And you know, for most of the 20th century, those are pretty small numbers of people that are actually, you know, making that transit. And then, like I said, just kind of some of these cases, when I started to learn more about the details, it just made me realize that it just had to be its own book. So I'm not positive if there's a straight line necessarily between these two things. If there is one, it has to do with the way that it's not straight. I think it's not a straight line. But it would have to do with the way that the nationalist government had to reappropriate, if I'm talking about the book about baseball, Colonial Project National Game. Pretty much the whole point of that book is that baseball is introduced to Taiwan by the Japanese, and it retains this Japanese culture and feeling and sentiment until today. And what the ROC government has to do when they get to Taiwan, they're destroying pretty much all remnants of Japanese culture that they can find, but there's this one exception, which is baseball. And baseball has to survive because they themselves promoted sports and see as a modern regime, as a very self-consciously modern regime. They see sports as a means to, you know, empower the citizenry and have the citizen identify very closely with the nation and all that. And so what part of that baseball book is about is how the government takes this Japanese culture and tries really hard to redefine it and make it more properly Chinese, even though Taiwanese people who know about it say it has nothing to do with Chinese culture, it has nothing to do with Mandarin. You know, it's a Japanese culture. That's what we play. We learned it from the Japanese. We play it the Japanese way. And so I think that if there is a connection, it would have to do with how at the same time, I guess that's probably the easiest thing to say, is that the KMT has these two tasks that are pretty much proceeding at the same time. One, which is a decolonization of a certain sort, even though they're recolonizing Taiwan. I think anyone would, you know, find that an acceptable way of talking about it. Getting rid of Japanese colonialism and Sinicizing Taiwan and making sure that people there learn this nationalist discourse. And again, these pilots as the best kind of example of people who are choosing the right part of the revolution that they want. They've seen the Maoist version, they want the Sun Yat-sen version. Here they are. Every once in a while, when I'm thinking about the connections, the literal connections, And I'm thinking of a time when Wurong Gun, that 1982 defector, came to a baseball tournament and kind of like held the bat and really didn't know what to do with it because baseball isn't much in the PRC. But hopefully that's an okay answer. I think that the state had these dual tasks, and I think that's what I would say, that they're related in those ways.
Thank you. And we have Dominic, you raise your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I just thought I sort of weighed in a little bit about, some of the stuff
Dominic, I think your voice is. Oh, the mic. Okay,
yeah, the mic.
Good,
Sorry,
great. Now we're
I
good.
folded the mic because I wanted a drink of coffee. Yeah, I apologize for that. So I just thought I weighed in a little some of the stuff that I wanted to sort of mention earlier, but I forgot. I should have used a PowerPoint slides. It makes things more organized and easier. Now, one of the things and this is also because I saw an anonymous question asked about the meaning of the anti-communist righteous warrior. What's the meaning of that, right? So so first of all, I think there's a difference between the image that's sort of constructed by the state and sort of propagated towards the people, right? And of course, whether or not the people will accept, let's say the mainlanders will accept it, but maybe the native Taiwanese or the indigenous population will be like, yeah, that's kind of not what I'm into. But I think that will be a little bit more, too simplistic, that kind of divide. So we have really very little understanding in terms of the dynamic between state narrative, state images, and also, the popular response, right? But even, given that kind of restriction in terms of how we read historical documents when these representation comes from the state, I think it is still, these instances and state representation of them and how these propaganda rhetorics were constructed, they are still quite indicative of Taiwanese society during the Cold War, because certain messages about the mainland, you can say that they're from the States, like this hell on earth over there, but you need someone coming from there from time to time to sort of substantiate, right? Because no one in Taiwan ever since 1949 can go to China. And that goes for the mainlanders and also the Taiwanese and the indigenous people who were already on Taiwan, before 1945, right? You do need this. And it is actually through this dynamic that you can sort of understand because when you are, this is, of course, the Cold War. I mean, there was hot war being fought, maybe in the front line, but not on Taiwan and not in China, right? But people can still experience the war in a certain way. And like I said, it is actually through these kind of instances and that's why it is very important to look at exchanges. And I totally agree with Andrew's point on that, right? It is absolutely important to look at these exchanges if you want to understand the Cold War dynamics and people's they're separated but kind of have different imaginations of one another, and they are sort of in an imagined war, and there's actually two Chinas. If you're not happy about one China, maybe you can go to the other if you have the means and you have the balls to take the risk, right? So that's the thing. So so that's part one. Part two, it's really about. I think I lost my train of thought a little bit. What the part two is about. Okay, I'll just stop at that. If that comes back to me, I'll speak again if we have more time. Okay.
And I was going to say one more thing about that. Just the idea of them being able to stand in as experts, as someone who's now seen both sides, and they can speak to how much better things are working in Taiwan. So goes the discourse. it always, I mean, at some point it starts telling me as well that the government knows that people don't believe them, that they've got to find these outsiders to come in and justify it, especially by the 80s when it's becoming pretty clear the nature of KMT rule, and it's becoming a lot easier to question it and to make fun of it. And ultimately, I hope it's okay if I throw this in, but just as an example, that the last one of these defectors comes in 1989, a guy named Jiang Wenhao. And during his press conference, it's disrupted by Taiwanese independence activists and led by Stella Chen or Chen Wanzhen. And she was on the blacklist for her Taiwanese independence activities. She had to sneak into Taiwan with a fake passport and a disguise. And she shows up and they're banging on the doors outside the press conference, and their signs say, communists can come here and get prizes, and Taiwanese can't even come in the border. And when they're arrested, there's a big demonstration. People are turning over police cars. And there's a demonstration within the next couple of days where that becomes the main theme. You're giving millions of dollars to communist pilots, and Taiwanese people can't even come back into the country. And it's the kind of thing where it just falls apart. What kind of, essentially, what kind of regime is still going to work like that and think that makes sense? And as soon as someone points it out, it happens to be these 4 women led by Stella Chen. As soon as someone points it out, it's like, it's over. And Li Denghui mercifully ends it in the middle of 1991.
Yeah, and on that, I just, good point, Andrew. On that, I just kind of recall what I really wanted, and this is a question I want to ask you. When I read this book and I didn't have a chance in my previous comment, is that did you have a chance to actually meet some of these anti-communist righteous warriors? I mean, former ones. Of course, some of them are still alive right now and they're working and living in Taiwan, right? And I think it will be, this is one of the things that I'm not saying I love this book, okay? But when I got to the very end, I was like, yeah, it will be I know the book is really already getting a little bit too long, but it will be amazing that if you can interview some of them, like right now, of course, it will be oral history, right? And it will be their memory, right? And to ask some of them how they think about their legacy, right? Because as you said, right, now if they are still living in Taiwan or even in overseas locations, or I think some of them went back to China or something, and one of them was locked up in China, you mentioned it, right? But they see this, that they were being sort of used as some kind of propaganda tool. Although they came on their own accord, they listened to the radio, they have accepted the propaganda, and this is how they bet their the rest of their lives on, right? Because it's with an understanding that they might not be able to return to their families in China ever again. Now their lives will be in Taiwan. And to see, the changes in Taiwan after democratization, to see the deconstruction of that nationalist ideology, right? It's, what they represent, or the state, prop them up to represent, right? It will be really amazing to really, ask them what they think about that right now. I mean, it's I say that in a very, not in a very like funny way. I mean, I think it will be sort of tragic. I think they will have a lot of things to say, right? Did you think about actually, searching some of them out and actually interview them?
Thanks. That is a regret of this book, and it's something I tried to do in my earlier books. And so the grad student, Meng-An, that you mentioned, who'd written about them, actually kind of gave me a list of essentially his efforts to reach them and talk to them. And it was a pretty short list of people who'd be willing to talk. And I had meant to talk to those. There were essentially 2 that I thought I could have a chance with. And it never happened. And the last couple of years just complicated things. But that is a regret. And I think if yeah, I think if I'd had maybe a bit more time, and
yeah,
us-
and the fact that, you know, of course you started with so few of them, right? But and the fact that, you know, among these, you know, maybe, you know, 18 or 20 people, that only 2 that are in Taiwan that are willing to talk, that shows you something. It is an indication of, you know, maybe they're feeling marginalized or kind of lost, like, what was my life all about? Right, I came here, I got the gold, yeah, it was okay, but then it was all for nothing, and this government has turned into, I think, you know, this pilot that you mentioned, the one that came in 1977, right, Yuan Yen, I think you already, you know, sort of did something, you know, towards this direction, right? I mean, because he was the one who says that, well, Taiwan is not what I thought that it will be. it was influenced, and I think you see this in a lot of instances when you study migration, right? You go to another location, you know, thinking that it will sort of, it's with people moving, right? There's always a lot of expectation, and in the end there's always, you gain something, but there's always some disappointment, right? Especially, and because this is the kind of research that I do, right? I study people's nostalgia for their home, then they return, the home was not home, and then anyway, oh yeah, you know, and I think, you know, these are people who move as well. So you see these dynamics in psychology of them as moving subjects as well. And yeah, I wish I see more of that, and in combination with this, like, oral history and actual history dynamics. But like I said, this is strictly from me, because these are the kind of research topic that I'm interested in because of my book, and but I think even without these, this is an original contribution and fascinating history already. Right. Okay, I'll just leave it at that.
I do think that, especially starting with Fan in 1977, and especially these people in the 1980s, they thought they were going to free China, and they just ended up in Taiwan. And it very quickly became Taiwan, and it became a free Taiwan with a lowercase f. And that free Taiwan with a lowercase f could only be achieved when this whole kind of structure was taken apart. So I think it's very easy to imagine them feeling like they just picked the wrong side, and especially if what they dreamed of was a strong and powerful China, it's almost like they just missed it.
And they can't go back. Right?
Right.
They're traitors back home, right? So
yeah, we are reaching toward maybe the final question for our event today. So there is actually a very interesting question submitted in the process of registration. So one of the audience would like to know that whether there will be female defector, because the photos that you show us seem to be the male defectors. And then so Professor Andrew, can you speak a little bit about the female defectors or the lack of them?
Yes, I did see this question. And so in this subset that has to do with pilots, and especially military pilots and some hijackers, there's only one woman in this group. If you were to expand out to the whole group of defectors and include all the people that escaped from the PRC and so on, then there would be, one would assume it'd be equal numbers, men and women. In this subset, there is only one woman, and it's Gao Dongping, and so she was one of the hijackers that came with the Zhuo Changyuan and was part of the Zhuo Changyuan hijacking. She was actually the one that had the guns packed in her luggage. And so she was really fiery. Zhuo had put together this group of, he was a really interesting person. He was a graduate of the Liaoning Aeronautical University, I want to say, really smart, really charismatic, and he found this this team of different people that were just fed up and needed to do something. And so I think she's a really interesting part of it. In the end, I think she is perhaps best known because she and Zhuo Xiang got married after a few years in Taiwan. And when these images were sent back to the PRC, Zhuo's wife, who was living in the PRC, sued him for bigamy. And in the PRC courts, and then it came through to the ROC courts. And so the two of them actually did, I think 3 months time for bigamy. I think that what's interesting though is that if one thinks about a woman who's at the heart of this culture, it was Teresa Tung, the singer, who she had always performed for military audiences, and she was very closely associated with that culture. So that's probably no surprise. But she didn't hijack a plane. She didn't take guns onto a plane and hijack it like Dongping did. And so she was the real thing. But unfortunately, her status, I think, was always secondary to the beautiful, talented Deng Lijun and her fame at the center of this culture. So ultimately, I think that I'd hope to do a little bit more kind of thinking about gender in this group. I think I tried to do it in thinking about the ways that they were represented in terms of the family that they left behind often, the families that they created in Taiwan, kind of these virtues of courage that were talked about. But in this group, it isn't really possible to talk much about women who are involved, because there's only this one.
All right, so thank you. So today's event is it's a critical conversation between Professor Maurice and Dominic, and also the audience. But if you want to learn more about the book, we'll recommend it to general readers like your friends or your family. Actually, I will be interviewing Professor Maurice in May in the New Books Network, and then so you can find us in any podcast platform or in the New Books Network website. And then I believe there you can also find an episode where Dominic speaks with Julie Chen about his book, The Great Exodus from China as well. So with that note, what a great way to conclude the Sinophone series for this semester. Thank you, Professor Maurice, for sharing your amazing work with us today. And thank you, Dominic, for offering insightful comments. And thank you, our audience, for joining us today from different time zones and sharing with us your feedback and your questions. Check out our website for more upcoming events hosted by USC EASC. I hope everybody stays safe and hope to see you again next time. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, Dr. Yang, everyone. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you all. We'll be in touch.
Great, thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Take care.
And then look forward to our next discussion too.